Millions in Syria and Iraq are facing water shortages as the region's longest river, the Euphrates, dries up. Israel and Jordan have been engaging in drought diplomacy over scarce water resources, while Kuwait is converting the world's largest tire dump into a city.
When drones flew over the Euphrates River in 2022, they captured footage that made scientists freeze in disbelief. Ancient city walls rising from the mud, gold artifacts glinting in the sun, tombs untouched for millennia suddenly exposed. But nobody was celebrating, because the reason these treasures appeared was terrifying. The river was vanishing.
The river has been the lifeline for millions in Iraq and Syria for thousands of years. But now it has sunk to a historic low, sparking the region's worst water crisis in years.
Entire communities abandoned, saltwater poisoning the taps, dead livestock everywhere. And then archaeologists found something in those ruins that changed everything. A warning carved in stone about what happens when the water runs out. The cradle of civilization was sending us a final message. In the summer of 2022, something extraordinary began to emerge from the depths of the Euphrates River. As water levels dropped to their lowest point in decades, the muddy riverbed started to reveal secrets that had been hidden for thousands of years. Ancient stone walls appeared first, then entire buildings, and finally the unmistakable outline of a lost city, perfectly preserved beneath the sediment. Archaeologists who rushed to the site could hardly believe what they were seeing. This was not just any ruin. It was a Bronze Age metropolis from the Mittani Empire, built more than 3,400 years ago and forgotten by history. The timing was both miraculous and tragic. For decades, these ruins had been submerged beneath the Mosul reservoir in northern Iraq, flooded when Saddam Hussein's government built a series of dams in the 1980s. Back then, entire ancient cities disappeared underwater, sacrificed in the name of irrigation and hydroelectric power. Local residents had protested, even sending delegations to Baghdad to beg officials to delay construction, but their pleas were ignored. The government insisted the benefits outweighed the costs, and so thousands of years of human history vanished beneath the rising water. Now, because of an unprecedented drought, those lost worlds were surfacing again. But the archaeologists knew they were racing against time. They had perhaps weeks, maybe months if they were lucky, before the waters would return. A team assembled in a matter of days, scrambling to secure emergency funding through German universities. When they arrived at the site, what they found exceeded every expectation. The city's walls stood remarkably intact, some reaching heights of 22 feet and thicknesses of 6 feet. Inside, they discovered the remains of wall paintings in vibrant shades of red and blue. Clay tablets covered in cuneiform writing lay scattered across ancient floors. These were not just buildings, they were time capsules from a civilization that once rivaled Egypt and Babylon in power and influence. The researchers worked frantically, mapping every street and structure before the drought ended. They found evidence of a sophisticated urban center with storage facilities, residential areas, and what appeared to be a massive palace complex. The preservation was astonishing. Researchers described it as if the city had simply been put to sleep. The dry Iraqi climate and layers of river mud had protected these structures better than anyone could have imagined. Every pottery shard, every architectural detail offered insights into how people lived, traded, and organized their society during the Bronze Age. But this discovery near Mosul was just one revelation among many. Further south, in Iraq's Anbar province, the receding Euphrates exposed over 80 additional archaeological sites. Cliffs that had been underwater for decades now revealed pre-Christian tombs carved directly into the rock face. Ancient cemeteries appeared, along with jails and buildings from the city of Telbas, dating back over 2,000 years. An Iraqi archaeologist named Yusuf Jasir Mohammed walked the newly exposed riverbanks, picking up pottery fragments and stone tools as if collecting fallen stars. He explained to journalists that civilization began here, in this very region, next to the Euphrates. For years, everyone assumed Anbar was nothing but empty desert with no historical importance. The floods had hidden the truth. Now that truth was emerging, and it told a story of unbroken human habitation stretching back to the very dawn of settled life. The director of Anbar's Antiquities Department, a man named Ratib Ali al-Kubaisi, described the situation with mixed emotions. On one hand, this was the archaeological opportunity of a lifetime. Sites that scholars had written off as lost forever were suddenly accessible. The area, once dismissed as a backwater, was proving to be one of the most important archaeological regions in all of Iraq. This part of the country was the first to be settled by ancient peoples. But with discovery came danger. The newly exposed sites were vulnerable. In all of Anbar province, just 10 guards protected these priceless remnants of human history. The treasures were obvious: gold jewelry, ancient coins, historical documents. All of these things were temptations for professional thieves and desperate people alike. Ratib worried constantly about looting. The region was poor, jobs were scarce, and an ancient artifact could feed a family for months. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same drought that was devastating local communities was also creating these archaeological windfalls. Fishermen who had worked the Euphrates for generations found themselves without income. A man named Saad Naji, who had fished these waters his entire life, stood on the exposed riverbed and tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The river was only 3 to 4 feet deep in places where it had once been dozens of feet. It was the lowest anyone could remember. Strange stone structures jutted out of the shallow water, like the bones of some great beast. Saad pointed to what looked like an ancient arch, half submerged, its stones crumbling as muddy waves lapped against it. For archaeologists, this was treasure. For people like Saad, it was the end of a way of life. The fishermen had no work anymore, he said simply. It was frightening. Scientists and historians understood they were witnessing something that should never have been possible. The Euphrates is the longest river in Western Asia, stretching nearly 2,800 kilometers from the mountains of Turkey through Syria and Iraq before joining with the Tigris and emptying into the Persian Gulf. Together with the Tigris, the Euphrates defines Mesopotamia, literally the land between two rivers. This is where humans first learned to farm, where they built the first cities, where they invented writing itself. Cuneiform tablets found along the Euphrates banks contain some of the oldest written words in human history. The river is mentioned in the Bible, in the Quran, in countless ancient texts. It has been called sacred, strategic, and essential for as long as humans have kept records. For the river to be drying up was unthinkable, yet here was the evidence, exposed for all to see. When the drought first struck in 2018, archaeologists managed to explore a palace with massive walls before the waters returned. They documented what they could but ran out of time before completing a proper survey. When the drought returned with even greater severity in 2022, they were more prepared. This time they knew they had to work faster and more comprehensively. They brought in teams, equipment, and funding. They mapped the entire city using GPS and aerial photography. They catalogued thousands of artifacts. And crucially, before the reservoir began to refill, they covered the entire site with protective tarps weighted down with gravel. It was an unusual step, but necessary. The team knew the water would eventually return, and when it did, they wanted to preserve what they had found for future excavations. Not everyone saw these discoveries as good news. Local residents watched archaeologists celebrate finds while their own children went hungry. The same water scarcity that exposed ancient wonders was destroying modern livelihoods. Livestock were dying. Crops were failing. Wells that had provided water for generations were running dry. In some areas, families were forced to rely on emergency deliveries of bottled water just to survive. The contrast was stark. Researchers from wealthy foreign universities flew in to study the past, while the present inhabitants of the region struggled to maintain basic necessities. The question that haunted everyone was simple. Why was this happening? Iraq is no stranger to drought. The region has experienced dry periods throughout history, but what was occurring now felt different in scale and severity. The river was not just low. In some stretches, it had essentially stopped flowing. Satellite images from space showed a thin brown line where there should have been a substantial waterway, and the timeline was alarming. Iraqi government officials warned that if current trends continued, the Euphrates could run completely dry by 2040. Not reduced, not diminished, but gone entirely. A river that had sustained human civilization for over 5,000 years could cease to exist within a single generation. As archaeologists carefully documented their finds and local communities adapted to increasingly desperate circumstances, a larger story was beginning to take shape. The drought was not a simple act of nature, it was the result of decisions made by governments, conflicts between nations, and a changing climate that no one fully understood. The ancient cities emerging from the riverbed were testaments to human ingenuity and resilience, but they were also warnings. These were civilizations that had thrived along the Euphrates for centuries before collapsing. Now their ruins were surfacing just as modern civilization faced its own crisis over the same precious resource. The Euphrates had witnessed the birth of human history. The question was whether it would also witness a crucial turning point in humanity's future. The Euphrates River crisis did not begin with drought. It began with concrete and steel, with dams and reservoirs, with the ambitions of nations competing for control over water that crosses borders without permission. The story of how water became a weapon starts in the mountains of Turkey, where both the Euphrates and Tigris originate from snowmelt in the Taurus Range. From there, these rivers flow southward through Syria and Iraq, sustaining millions of people along their course. But for decades, the nations sharing these waterways have been locked in a struggle that has brought them to the brink of war more than once. Turkey holds an overwhelming advantage in this competition. It controls 90% of the Euphrates flow and 44% of the Tigris. This geographic reality gives Ankara enormous power over its downstream neighbours. Beginning in the 1960s, Turkey embarked on one of the most ambitious dam-building projects in modern history. The Southeastern Anatolia project, known by its Turkish acronym GAP, was conceived as a massive infrastructure program to transform the country's poorest region into an agricultural and industrial powerhouse. The plan called for 22 dams and 19 hydroelectric plants along the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, with the capacity to irrigate millions of hectares and generate thousands of megawatts of electricity. On paper, GAP was an engineering triumph that would lift millions of Turkish citizens out of poverty. In practice, it became a source of bitter conflict. Every dam Turkey built reduced the amount of water flowing to Syria and Iraq. Every reservoir it filled meant less water for farmers downstream. By some estimates, Turkish dam construction has cut water to Iraq by 80% since 1975. Syria has seen its water flow reduced by approximately 40%. For countries that depend almost entirely on these rivers for agriculture and drinking water, the impact has been devastating. The first major crisis came in 1975, shortly after Turkey completed the Keben Dam and Syria finished the Tabqa Dam. That year, Iraq accused Syria of withholding water from the Euphrates, claiming that flow had dropped from the normal 920 cubic meters per second to an intolerable 197. Iraq alleged that Syria's actions had ruined 70% of its winter crops and destroyed the livelihoods of 3 million farmers. Syria responded that Turkey was the real culprit, having reduced the flow crossing into Syrian territory by more than half. The dispute escalated rapidly. Both countries moved troops to their common border. Iraq threatened to bomb Syria's Tabqa Dam. For weeks, the region teetered on the edge of war. Only intervention by Saudi Arabia and the Soviet Union prevented military conflict, with a hastily negotiated agreement that saw Syria release additional water from its reservoirs in exchange for assurances about Turkish flows. But the agreement did nothing to resolve the fundamental problem. Turkey has consistently rejected the idea that the Euphrates and Tigris are international rivers subject to water-sharing treaties. Instead, Ankara insists these are transboundary rivers that happen to cross borders but remain under the sovereign control of each nation within its territory. This position allows Turkey to build and operate dams as it sees fit, without legal obligation to maintain specific flow rates downstream. Iraq and Syria, by contrast, argue that these are shared international waterways that require negotiated allocations. The disagreement is not merely semantic. It determines whether downstream countries have legal rights to water or must rely on Turkish goodwill. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, diplomatic efforts produced little more than rhetoric. Turkey, Syria, and Iraq established joint technical committees that met periodically but failed to reach binding agreements. In 1987, Turkey reportedly promised Syria a minimum flow of 500 cubic meters per second, a figure that would provide roughly 16 billion cubic meters annually. Iraq requested that this amount be split, with itself receiving at least half. But these informal understandings were never formalized into treaties ratified by parliaments. When conditions changed or political tensions rose, the commitments evaporated. The most dramatic demonstration of Turkey's control came in 1990, when workers prepared to fill the reservoir behind the massive Ataturk Dam. For an entire month, Turkey held back the waters of the Euphrates. Downstream, Syria and Iraq watched in alarm as their sections of the river slowed to a trickle. Baghdad and Damascus issued furious protests, accusing Ankara of using water for political leverage. The incident showed beyond doubt that Turkey possessed the physical ability to turn the Euphrates on and off like a tap. It was a display of power that neither Syria nor Iraq could match or counter. The situation grew even more complicated when water became entangled with other regional conflicts. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Turkey fought a bloody insurgency against Kurdish separatist groups, particularly the Kurdistan Workers' Party known as the PKK. Syria provided sanctuary and support to these Kurdish fighters, allowing them to operate training camps on Syrian soil. Turkey accused Damascus of waging proxy warfare. In 1998, tensions reached a breaking point. Turkey massed troops on the Syrian border and issued an ultimatum: expel the PKK leadership or face military invasion. Syria capitulated, signing the Adana Accord that required it to cease all support for Kurdish militants. Although the agreement focused on security issues, water politics lurked in the background. Turkey's control over Syrian water supplies gave it leverage that extended far beyond the river itself. When civil war erupted in Syria in 2011, water transformed from a point of diplomatic tension into an active weapon of war. Various factions quickly recognized that whoever controlled the dams controlled the population. The Islamic State, during its territorial expansion, made seizing water infrastructure a top priority. The group understood that dams provided more than just water. They generated electricity, enabled agriculture, and gave the ability to punish or reward communities downstream. In 2014, after capturing the Fallujah Dam on the Euphrates, Islamic State fighters closed the floodgates and withheld water from Baghdad and the agricultural regions of central and southern Iraq. At the same time, rising water behind the dam flooded government military positions. Days later, the group released a massive surge through an irrigation channel, deliberately flooding 200 square kilometers and putting the city of Abu Ghraib under 4 meters of water. The tactic was not unique to the Islamic State. Nearly every armed group in Syria employed water as a tool of warfare. Opposition forces, government troops, and Kurdish militias all targeted or controlled water supplies at various points in the conflict. The city of Aleppo saw its water system repeatedly attacked or shut down by whoever was trying to capture it at the time. Civilians suffered regardless of which side held the infrastructure. The deliberate manipulation of water supplies exemplified a new kind of warfare where natural resources became weapons as powerful as bullets or bombs. Turkey's role in the Syrian conflict added another layer to the water crisis. Kurdish forces, organized under the Syrian Democratic Forces, gained control of significant territory in northeastern Syria, including several important dams. Turkey viewed this Kurdish autonomous region as a direct threat, particularly after the SDF captured the Tishrin Dam in 2015, giving them control over water flow from the western bank of the Euphrates. Turkey had declared a red line against Kurdish forces crossing to the west of the river, and the dam's capture held enormous symbolic and strategic significance. According to multiple reports from Syrian and Kurdish authorities, Turkey began restricting water flow into Syrian territory. The United Nations, the Syrian government, and Kurdish factions all accused Ankara of deliberately withholding water. What had once provided 500 cubic meters per second was reduced to 250 or less, barely half the agreed amount. Turkish officials have consistently denied using water as a political weapon, arguing that reduced flow results from drought and increased domestic demand. But the timing of water reductions often coincided with Turkish military operations or political disputes with Kurdish groups. In more recent years, Turkey-backed rebel groups have been accused of systematically targeting water infrastructure in northeastern Syria. Turkish aircraft have struck pumping stations, power plants that run water treatment facilities, and even dams themselves. In 2024 and 25, areas around Kobane were repeatedly deprived of water following military assaults. power facilities at dams were damaged, rendering them unable to generate electricity. The attacks served dual purposes. They weakened Kurdish forces militarily, while also undermining their ability to provide basic services to the population under their control. The weaponization of water created a humanitarian disaster. Without electricity to run pumps, communities could not access groundwater. Without functioning treatment plants, drinking water became contaminated. Northeastern Syria experienced outbreaks of waterborne diseases, including cholera, which spread through areas where people were forced to drink from unsafe sources. Agricultural irrigation collapsed, turning fertile fields into dusty wastelands. Farmers who had grown wheat and cotton for generations watched their crops wither. Some abandoned their land entirely, joining the millions of Syrians displaced by war and environmental catastrophe. Iraq faced similar pressures from multiple directions. In addition to reduced flows from Turkey, Iran also built dams on rivers that feed into Iraqi territory, particularly on the Karen River in the south, and various rivers flowing into the Kurdistan region. Iraqi officials found themselves squeezed between powerful upstream neighbors, each pursuing their own interests with little regard for Iraqi needs. Efforts to negotiate water-sharing agreements repeatedly failed. In 2009, Turkey and Iraq signed a Memorandum of Understanding on water management, as did Turkey and Syria. But neither parliament ratified these agreements, and they remained as worthless as the paper they were printed on. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Without enforceable treaties, water allocation depended on the goodwill of the upstream country. Turkey continued to insist that Iraq and Syria needed better water management practices rather than more water. Turkish officials pointed out that much of the water reaching Iraq was wasted through inefficient irrigation, evaporation from poorly designed canals, and outdated agricultural techniques. There was truth to these criticisms, but they did not change the reality that Turkish dams had drastically reduced the total volume of water available downstream. A country cannot manage water it does not receive. By the early 2020s, what had begun as diplomatic tensions had evolved into an existential crisis. The Euphrates was not just low. In many places, it had been reduced to a muddy stream barely worthy of the name river. And the water that did flow was increasingly contaminated with agricultural runoff, industrial waste, and salt from upstream irrigation. The quality had declined so severely that much of it was unsuitable for drinking or even farming. The river that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for 5 millennia was dying not from natural causes, but from the accumulated weight of human decisions, political conflicts, and the refusal of nations to cooperate over their most vital shared resource. If political manipulation of the Euphrates created the conditions for disaster, climate change arrived to ensure that disaster became inevitable. Starting in 2020, a convergence of factors began to squeeze the river from every direction. Reduced rainfall, soaring temperatures, excessive evaporation, and continued upstream damming combined into a perfect storm that pushed the entire Tigris-Euphrates basin toward collapse. What emerged was not simply a drought in the traditional sense, but a fundamental shift in the region's environmental reality. The numbers tell a stark story. Between 2020 and 2025, the region experienced what scientists classify as extreme to exceptional agricultural drought, based on the Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, a measure that combines rainfall with evaporative demand. Iran and the Tigris-Euphrates basin endured conditions that would normally occur only once every 50 to 100 years. But in today's climate, which has warmed by roughly 1.3 degrees Celsius due to fossil fuel emissions, such severe droughts now arrive every 10 years. The frequency has increased 5-fold, and there is no indication the trend will reverse. For communities along the Euphrates, the abstract statistics translated into lived catastrophe. In Syria, rainfall dropped by nearly 70% in some regions. This devastated 75% of the country's rain-fed farmland, the agricultural backbone that had sustained Syrian civilization since ancient times. The country faced a wheat shortfall estimated at 2.73 million tons, in a nation already torn apart by more than a decade of civil war. The loss of food production pushed millions towards starvation. Aid organizations warned that 12 million Syrians faced acute food insecurity, meaning they did not know where their next meal would come from. Iraq fared no better. In 2025, the country recorded its driest year since 1933, nearly a century of record-keeping. Water levels in the Tigris and Euphrates dropped by up to 27% compared to historical averages. The decline was not gradual. In some areas, communities watched the river shrink week by week, sometimes losing centimeters of depth each day. Iraqi government officials warned that the country's water reserves had fallen to their lowest point in 80 years. The Ministry of Water Resources, tasked with managing this crisis, could offer little beyond dire predictions. If current trends continued, they said, the Euphrates could cease flowing entirely by 2040. Temperature increases compounded the water shortage. Northeastern Syria has warmed by 1 degree Celsius over the past century, which might sound modest until you consider what that means for evaporation. Warmer air holds more moisture and pulls it more aggressively from any available source. Rivers, reservoirs, soil and plants all lose water faster when temperatures rise. Average rainfall has decreased by 18 millimeters per month per century, creating a double squeeze where less water falls from the sky while more disappears into the atmosphere. The reservoirs behind Turkey's dams became evaporation ponds on a massive scale. Scientists estimate that annual evaporation from Turkish reservoirs alone reaches 2 cubic kilometers. Syrian reservoirs lose another cubic kilometer. Iraqi reservoirs, larger and exposed to even more intense heat, lose 5 cubic kilometers annually. That is 8 cubic kilometers of water vanishing into thin air every year, water that once flowed downstream to farmers and cities. For perspective, 8 cubic kilometers would be enough to supply a major city for several years. The drought also revealed how fragile the region's water infrastructure had become. In northeastern Syria, the Euphrates Lake behind the Tabqa Dam dropped to critically low levels. The lake, which should maintain a water level of 304 meters above sea level, fell to 298 meters, a loss of more than 5 meters depth. This represented a shortage of approximately 4 billion cubic meters of water. Authorities faced an impossible choice. They could release water to meet current needs for drinking and irrigation, but doing so would drain the strategic reserve needed for future seasons. Or they could hold back water to preserve reserves, but condemn current crops and communities to failure. There was no good option. The co-chair of the Energy Authority in the city of Al-Tabqa explained that officials had been forced to implement strict controls on water flowing from the dam. They needed to preserve what little remained in the lake to ensure drinking water for 6 million people and to salvage whatever they could of the agricultural seasons. She made public appeals for international intervention, calling on the Syrian government to pressure Turkey through official diplomatic channels to release the agreed 500 cubic meters per second. The pleas went largely unanswered. As the river shrank, its character changed. What water remained became increasingly contaminated. Iraq experienced this most acutely in the south, where salt water from the Persian Gulf began pushing upstream into the freshwater system. Basra, a port city of 3.5 million people, at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates, found itself facing an impossible situation. The city sits near where the rivers meet to form the Shat al-Arab waterway before emptying into the Gulf. Under normal conditions, the volume and pressure of fresh water flowing downstream keeps saltwater at bay. But as the river flow weakened, seawater advanced inland like an invading army. The saltwater intrusion devastated Basra's ecosystem. A water resources expert named Ala al-Badrani documented the loss of between 26 and 30 different marine species due to rising salinity. Fish that had lived in these waters for millennia could not adapt quickly enough. Fishermen pulled up nets empty or filled with dead and dying catches. The brackish water contaminated irrigation systems, killing crops and leaving white salt crusts on fields that had been green for generations. Most critically, the salt reached drinking water supplies. Residents turned on taps to find water that tasted of the ocean, completely undrinkable. Families across southern Iraq were forced to rely on daily deliveries of bottled water or tanker trucks to meet basic needs. Schools closed because they could not provide safe drinking water for students. Hospitals struggled to maintain sanitary conditions. The scene seemed impossible for a 21st century nation, yet they became routine. Women and children lined up in open fields to collect water rations, carrying plastic containers back to homes where the plumbing still worked but delivered only salt water. The contamination extended beyond salt. As river flow decreased, the concentration of pollutants increased. Agricultural runoff from Turkish and Syrian farms carried fertilizers and pesticides downstream. The reduced water volume could not dilute these chemicals, which accumulated to toxic levels. Industrial waste from cities along the river added heavy metals and other contaminants. The water that reached Iraq was not just reduced in quantity, but poisoned in quality. Testing revealed that total dissolved solids, a measure of water purity, had doubled between Turkish reservoirs and the Syrian-Iraqi border. Water that was marginally acceptable for irrigation upstream became hazardous by the time it reached the southern provinces. The agricultural collapse triggered cascading failures throughout the economy. Iraq was losing an estimated 25,000 hectares of arable land annually, mostly in the south, to desertification and salinization. Farmers who had worked the same land for generations found themselves with no choice but to abandon it. Some moved to cities, swelling urban populations already struggling with unemployment and inadequate services. Others remained, desperately trying to coax crops from increasingly barren soil, falling deeper into debt with each failed harvest. Syria faced similar devastation. The drought that began in 2006 had already forced large numbers of rural people into cities, a migration that many analysts believe contributed to the social tensions that erupted into civil war. Now, with the drought intensifying rather than easing, that displacement continued. Entire villages in northeastern Syria stood abandoned. Houses that had sheltered families for generations sat empty, their doors open to the wind, their fields returned to dust. The environmental damage extended to ecosystems that had survived for millennia. The Mesopotamian marshes, once the largest wetland ecosystem in the Middle East, shrank dramatically. These marshes, sometimes called the Garden of Eden, support unique biodiversity and have been home to the marsh Arab people for thousands of years. As water flow decreased, the marshes dried up. Reed beds that had provided building materials and habitat for countless species turned brown and brittle. Water buffalo, central to marsh Arab culture, died for lack of food and water. Bird populations that migrate through the region each year found fewer places to rest and feed. The Euphrates soft-shell turtle, a species found nowhere else on Earth, faced extinction. This unique animal, which had survived every previous challenge in the river's long history, could not survive the combination of habitat destruction, water pollution, and reduced flow. Conservation efforts seemed futile when the river itself was dying. Multiple species of birds, including the marble teal, Dalmatian pelican, and various eagles, found their populations crashing as wetlands disappeared. The human toll continued to mount in ways both dramatic and subtle. A cholera outbreak that began in Syria in September 2022 spread through communities forced to drink contaminated water. The disease, largely eliminated from the region in previous decades, returned with a vengeance. Thousands fell ill. Children and elderly people, most vulnerable to waterborne diseases, died in numbers that overwhelmed local health systems already devastated by war. In Iraq's western Anbar province, the same drought that exposed archaeological treasures destroyed modern livelihoods. The reservoir behind Haditha Dam had shrunk by 90% since summer, according to local officials. What was once an enormous body of water, stretching as far as the eye could see, had become a series of disconnected pools surrounded by cracked mud. The transformation happened so quickly that it left people stunned. Fishermen described the change as frightening, using a word normally reserved for disasters and death. By 2023 and 24, the crisis had moved beyond environmental damage into existential threat. Climate scientists studying the region warned that the combination of reduced rainfall, increased evaporation, and continued upstream damming had pushed the Tigris-Euphrates system into a new state. This was not a temporary drought that would end when rains returned. The entire hydrological system had fundamentally changed. Even if rainfall increased to historical averages, which seemed increasingly unlikely, the volume of water reaching Iraq would remain a fraction of what it had been. The reservoirs in Turkey would capture most of any increase. The remaining water would evaporate in the heat, and the demand from growing populations would consume whatever made it downstream. A researcher at Chatham House named Haider al-Shakeri summarized the situation bluntly. While reduced rainfall and rising temperatures were global challenges affecting many regions, Iraq's water crisis was also the result of upstream restrictions and internal neglect. The country was caught between forces beyond its control and failures of its own making. Neither problem could be solved quickly or easily. and time was running out. The Euphrates River, which had witnessed the birth of human civilization, was dying. The only question was whether anything could be done to save it, or whether the cradle of civilization would become its graveyard. The consequences of the Euphrates collapse arrived not as a single catastrophic event, but as a slow unraveling of everything that depended on the river. Communities that had existed for thousands of years found themselves facing choices their ancestors never had to contemplate. Stay and struggle with increasingly scarce water, or abandon the land that defined their identity. For many, there was no real choice at all. Survival demanded adaptation, migration, or both. In southern Iraq, the situation reached a level that seemed impossible for a modern nation. Salt water had pushed so far upstream that municipal water systems could no longer function. Taps in homes delivered brackish water suitable for nothing. Families that had never worried about water access suddenly found themselves entirely dependent on external supplies. Helicopters flew in emergency water tanks. Aid organizations established distribution points in open fields. People lined up with empty containers, waiting their turn to collect enough water for cooking, washing, and drinking. A woman interviewed by local journalists expressed the bewilderment everyone felt. "We have lived by this river our whole lives," she said. "Now we have to buy water to drink. How does that make sense?" Schools throughout the affected regions closed not because of violence or political instability, but because they could not provide safe drinking water for students. Education, already disrupted by years of conflict in Syria and instability in Iraq, suffered another blow. An entire generation was growing up with fragmented schooling and the lived experience of watching their environment collapse. Farmers confronted equally stark realities. Those who remained on their land watched crops fail year after year. Without adequate irrigation water, wheat and barley withered before reaching maturity. Fruit trees that had produced for decades simply died, their roots unable to find moisture in soil, baked hard as concrete. Livestock suffered terribly. As wells dried up and river access disappeared, herders had no way to sustain their animals. Some sold their flocks at devastating losses. Others watched them die. The economic ripples spread far beyond agriculture. Iraq's water reserves dropping to their lowest level in 80 years meant that hydroelectric generation declined sharply. Power outages became routine across the country. Businesses that depended on reliable electricity either closed or operated at reduced capacity. The entire logistics chain that depended on river transport started to break down. Meanwhile, archaeologists continued their race against time. The teams that had documented the Bronze Age city near Mosul knew their window was closing. Before the reservoir refilled, they covered the entire site with protective tarps and gravel, a desperate attempt to preserve what they had found for future study. But they also knew the broader situation was dire. The director of Anbar's Antiquities Office worried constantly about looting. With only 10 guards protecting vulnerable sites across the entire province and with poverty driving people to desperate measures, the newly exposed ruins were at constant risk. Ancient coins, jewelry, and artifacts disappeared into black markets. The political dimensions of the crisis showed no signs of resolution. Despite years of negotiations, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq remained unable to agree on binding water-sharing arrangements. The memorandums of understanding signed in 2009 went unratified. Turkey continued to assert its right to develop water resources within its territory. Syria and Iraq continued to demand their rightful share of river flow. The positions had not changed in decades and showed no indication of changing now. Religious communities watched the river's decline through the lens of prophecy. In Islamic tradition, a hadith attributed to Muhammad states that the last hour will not come until the Euphrates uncovers a mountain of gold over which people will fight, with 99 out of every 100 combatants dying in the struggle. Christian interpretations of the Book of Revelation describe the Euphrates drying up in the end times. For millions of believers across the region, the river's dramatic decline seemed to confirm ancient predictions. Yet amid the despair, small efforts at restoration continued. Environmental groups in Iraq planted native reeds and mangroves in areas where water still flowed. Geology students collected sediment samples to understand how wetlands might be reconstructed. Engineers proposed more efficient irrigation systems. These initiatives were modest compared to the scale of the crisis, but they represented something important. They were acts of hope. The Euphrates has survived 5,000 years of human civilization, flowing through empires that rose and fell, witnessing wars, plagues, and countless droughts. But resilience has limits. A river can only absorb so much damming, so much diversion, so much extraction before it simply cannot continue. The archaeological sites emerging from the riverbed serve as reminders that great civilizations have collapsed before when they mismanaged their water resources. The question is whether modern civilization will prove wiser than its predecessors.